He's asked for you." That's all the Vatican doctor said as the cardinals stood frozen in the hallway. The Pope had hours, maybe minutes. No press, no clergy, just a dying man and a final request. A single Swiss guard, summoned in silence. Lucas entered the papal chamber alone. The door shut behind him. Francis turned his head, eyes clouded but alive. His voice cracked like parchment. "Lock the door." And what happened next was never meant to be seen, recorded, or repeated. He didn't hand Lucas a relic. He gave him a sentence, a final order meant to live only in memory, until the day it had to be spoken aloud. Before we show you what that whisper was, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because what you're about to hear still echoes beneath the marble of the Vatican. Long before the final summons, Lucas Bowman had already learned how to disappear in plain sight. He was the kind of man who spoke with stillness, whose silence drew no attention but never went unnoticed. 15 years in the Swiss Guard, and not once had his name appeared in any disciplinary report. No missed drills, no uniform infraction. He stood in sun, in rain, in ceremony, in chaos, unmoving, unshaken. While others found the strain of stillness unbearable, Lucas wore it like breath. He didn't laugh during downtime. He didn't tell stories in the mess hall. He prayed quietly and served precisely. He was not popular, but he was trusted, and without ever asking for it, he was selected again and again for the most sacred of posts, the apostolic palace, papal residence, inner detail. Francis never spoke to him directly, not at first. The Pope would pass during morning walks in the gardens, nod once in Lucas's direction, but there were no exchanges, just awareness. Then one spring morning, years before the funeral, something happened that no one documented. A child had slipped from a tourist group in the square, panicked, crying, lost among the steps. Protocol said wait. Signal another officer. Lucas didn't wait. He moved. 15 feet. 1 moment. Just enough to lift the child above the heads of the crowd until the boy's mother appeared, breathless and weeping. The breach was minor, corrected in seconds. Cameras missed it. No one reported it. But a week later, Lucas returned to his quarters after drill to find an envelope on his pillow. No seal, no signature. Just one line, handwritten in faint black ink. "I saw you," and so did he. He never told anyone about that note, but from that day on he carried it in the lining of his locker. Creases worn, corners softened, like a blessing no one else needed to understand. Francis never mentioned it. But Lucas knew. The Pope had been watching. Not the uniform, not the stillness, the man inside it. The chamber was quiet except for the faint ticking of a wall clock and the shallow breath of a dying man. Lucas stood just inside the door, still in uniform but no longer on duty, at least not in the way he had always understood it. The Pope lay propped on a simple pillow, wrapped in plain linen, his skin pale as parchment and drawn thin across his cheekbones. His eyes were open, searching the dim ceiling as if trying to remember the shape of the sky. And then they found Lucas. A small gesture, a flick of 2 fingers called him closer. He approached slowly, respectfully, not as a guard but as something quieter. The Pope's voice was low, almost lost in the hush. "They think I should talk about Rome," he said, "about succession, about doctrine." He smiled weakly. "I don't care about any of that." Lucas said nothing. The Pope continued, "I've seen power make people forget their purpose. I've watched truth turned into theater, and I've sat in rooms full of men who believe silence is always holy." He turned his head fully now, looking straight at Lucas. "But silence is only holy when it protects the soul, not when it hides what must be said." Lucas stood still, his hands folded behind him, but his eyes held steady. The Pope's next words came slowly, carefully, like placing stones along a path only one man would walk. "There's something I couldn't say in public," he said, voice frayed by age but unshaken in intent. "But I need one man to carry it." He didn't hand over a paper. He didn't dictate it twice. Just a few words, spoken once clearly and with a final breath behind them. Lucas listened, memorized, and bowed his head. "If the body forgets the soul," Francis whispered, "you must speak." He reached for Lucas's hand, held it with surprising strength for a man so near the end. Then his grip loosened, his gaze softened, and he let go, not of Lucas, but of the world. When the chamber fell still, Lucas stood for a moment longer. He looked at the man, no longer a pope, only a body, and then quietly turned the lock, opened the door, and stepped into the hall. The cardinals rose from their seats, expecting a report, a nod, a word. Lucas gave them none. He passed them silently, shoulders straight, eyes forward, the message alive only in his memory. The bells tolled for nearly an hour. From rooftops and towers across Vatican City, their deep metallic voices rolled out over the crowd gathered below. Thousands had come. Dignitaries, clergy, pilgrims, photographers. They filled every stone step, every corridor of shadow and light across St. Peter's Square. High above them, the flags of nations stirred in a wind that didn't quite carry warmth. At the center of it all, beneath the full gaze of the world, lay the cypress coffin of Pope Francis, plain, unvarnished, marked by a single wooden crucifix. No gold, no velvet, just the weight of a quiet man and the silence he had left behind. Among the ceremonial line of guards, Lucas stood motionless. His halberd rested against his shoulder, his eyes fixed forward, his mind elsewhere. The cameras moved slowly across the formation, pausing on faces, then drifting on. None of them paused long on him. He was doing what he always did, standing still, blending into history's backdrop. But inside his chest, just above his heart, the Pope's final words lived like fire. He could still hear them as if they had been spoken seconds ago. "If the body forgets the soul, you must speak." Cardinals stepped forward to deliver eulogies. Their Latin flowed over the marble like water, measured, ceremonial, beautiful. But Lucas didn't hear most of it. He watched the incense rise in slow spirals and tried to understand how something so sacred could feel so unfinished. A few rows back, choir boys shifted nervously. Cameras clicked. The rituals moved forward, perfectly timed, perfectly choreographed. And yet none of them knew what had truly been passed in that final hour. Only Lucas, only him. After the final blessing, as the guards shifted position, a younger recruit stepped beside him, barely 20, eyes wide with questions he hadn't yet learned to hide. He looked at Lucas, hesitated, then whispered, "What did he say to you in the room?" Lucas didn't blink, didn't glance over, didn't answer. Just the sound of footsteps over stone and the quiet creak of leather as the formation turned once more. What had been said would not be spoken. Not yet. In the days that followed the funeral, the Vatican moved with the smoothness of machinery practiced for centuries. Robes flowed through stone halls. Latin prayers echoed from domed ceilings. Meetings resumed. Briefings were held. Statements were drafted, translated, and broadcast to billions. The conclave loomed in quiet formality, and yet something trembled beneath the surface, like the hollow hum of a pipe before it bursts. Not grief, not reverence, power. Cardinal Anton della Vera, dean of the College of Cardinals, called for a closed-door gathering of senior clergy. The agenda was simple, reaffirming unity. But the room knew better. Men arrived in silence, adjusting cuffs and hiding ambition behind tired eyes. Lucas was not meant to be there. But his reassignment hadn't been processed yet, and the ceremonial detail had been left temporarily intact. He stood in the corner, half-shadowed beneath an arched wall, invisible as ever, listening, watching. The cardinal began slowly, speaking of duty, of tradition, of returning to clarity. His tone was polished, confident, but laced with something colder, certainty shaped like a blade. "We must remember," he said, "that the Holy Father served the institution. His personal sentiments, though well-meaning, were not doctrine." A few heads nodded, others hesitated. There were times, De la Vera continued, when mercy blurred discipline, when compassion softened resolve. We cannot afford softness now. The Church must remain still. Stillness. The word landed like a bell in Lucas's chest. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His grip on the halberd tightened just enough for the leather to creak beneath his glove. That was it. The moment the Pope had warned him about. Not with drama, not with flames, but with words spoken gently, intended to make the Church smaller than its soul. Lucas's jaw clenched. He could still feel the dying weight of the Pope's hand, still hear that final whisper, buried behind his ribs like a sealed confession. The room continued on, the cardinal speaking of loyalty, of order, of moving forward without distraction. But Lucas wasn't hearing it anymore. He was remembering the look in the Pope's eyes when he said, "This is not for them to carry, just you." As the cardinal wrapped up, calling for renewed strength and public unity, Lucas stepped forward. The sound of his boots striking marble broke the rhythm of the room like a dropped relic. Heads turned. Silence followed. He stopped just behind the last seated bishop. Not grandstanding, not seeking permission. Just one man standing straight in the house of power. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "If the body forgets the soul," Lucas said calmly, "you must speak." The words struck harder than any outburst could have. Clear, centered, familiar. The room froze. Some stared in shock, others in disbelief. A few, the ones who had known Francis best, looked down, their expressions unreadable. Cardinal De la Vera stiffened. "Who gave you permission to speak?" he asked, voice controlled but tight. Lucas didn't answer the question. He didn't have to. The Pope already had. He turned, walked back to his place by the wall, and resumed his post. But nothing was the same. In one moment, stillness had given way to truth. And it wasn't shouted. It was remembered. The summons came without ceremony. A folded envelope slid beneath his door at dawn. No crest, no wax, just a typed instruction. Report to the Office of Personnel by 0800 hours. Lucas read it once, then again. There was no reprimand, no citation, no explanation. But he understood. They wouldn't punish him because they couldn't afford to. Too many had heard. Too many had paused when he spoke. The Church didn't like fractures. It preferred quiet realignments. And so they wouldn't remove him. They would simply move him. When he arrived, the conversation was brief, polite, administrative. The prefect didn't even look up from his papers. Effective immediately, he said, "You'll be reassigned to the Apostolic Archives. Security detail, no public rotations, no ceremonial duties, just oversight and preservation." There was no malice in his voice, just policy. "This is not disciplinary," the prefect added, almost as if reading from a script. "It's for optics." Lucas nodded once. He didn't ask questions. There was no need. This was not exile. It was quiet removal, polished around the edges, made presentable for the institution's image. He would not wear the vibrant blue, red, and gold again. No more ceremonies. No more tourists with cameras. No more standing watch at the doors of power. The marble floors and velvet halls would go on without him. But he didn't resist, because he knew what they didn't. The Pope's words were never meant to become a speech. They weren't written to be printed in Vatican newsletters or quoted from a pulpit. They were a private legacy, a single sentence delivered like a dying breath, meant to live only inside one man. And Lucas had spoken them, not to the world, but to the moment that demanded them. That was enough. His uniform was folded and returned. His name was quietly removed from ceremonial rosters. His photograph was never released. The world would forget him. History would not list him. But in one marble room, on one particular morning, the silence had been broken. And that silence had listened. Lucas descended into the lower levels of the apostolic archives without protest. No candles, no guards lining the halls, just rows of parchment, stone walls that breathed cold, and 1,000 years of recorded memory. He walked among history now, not to guard it in ceremony, but to protect it in stillness. And though no one would say it, they all understood. This wasn't punishment. It was preservation. He had done what was asked. He had remembered the soul when the body tried to forget. And now he would disappear, just as quietly as he had served. The weeks passed without incident. Lucas kept to the lower halls, patrolling the outer corridors of the apostolic archives with quiet precision. No one asked him to explain why he had been reassigned. No one questioned why the guard who once stood nearest to the Pope now walked among documents and shadows. That was how the Vatican worked, through controlled silence. But silence did not always mean absence. One afternoon, as the sunlight angled through the Vatican gardens in long golden lines, a tour group passed along the gravel path. Children in matching uniforms, their shoes scuffing rhythmically beneath the teacher's soft instructions. Lucas had just stepped out from the archive gate, his black security uniform blending with the trees behind him, when a boy at the end of the line slowed his pace. 10, maybe 11, dark hair, curious eyes. He looked up at Lucas, puzzled, and then blinked with recognition. "Weren't you the guard who was with the Pope when he died?" the boy asked. Lucas paused. There was no sharp intake of breath, no flicker of panic, just the faintest curve at the edge of his mouth. Half smile, half memory. He didn't answer right away. Then, gently, almost too softly for the moment to feel rehearsed, he said, "Some things aren't meant to be remembered by the world, just protected." The boy looked confused, but nodded like he understood enough to carry the moment forward. He turned and ran to rejoin his class. The teacher called out in Italian for them to stay together. The group moved on. Lucas stood for a while beneath the ancient trees. The gravel path stretched behind him like a forgotten timeline. His figure, straight-backed and still, blended into the surrounding silence as if he had always been part of the place. The camera would have lost him in that frame. No medals, no colors, no symbols left to signal what he had done. But he hadn't carried a secret. He had carried a legacy, a sentence passed from a dying man to a loyal servant. Not shouted, not published, just spoken once in a room locked from the world and released only when the time demanded it. Was the Pope's final act of leadership a whisper, meant for one heart only? If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in duty, in silence, and in the kind of truth that doesn't need to be shouted to change the world.